Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast for sustainable procurement. I'm Shaun McCarthy, Director of Action and Sustainability Community Interest Company. This is episode 2 of our podcast with Laura Dombi from DNV, where we talk about the role of audit in a broader supply chain management context. I think it's interesting that you mentioned having a holistic picture of supply chain risk, and I guess it probably goes beyond that in terms of a more strategic view of supply chain management. And if I just a couple of examples again from my own experience was the computer manufacturer that changes all of its suppliers every 6 months. Not all at the same time, but the life of a component supplier for this manufacturer is 6 months, and then they move on, they go out to competitive tender, and they engage another supplier in the interest purely of just driving the price down and down. Well, by the time you finish an audit and done the report, that supplier's gone, and you've started another supplier, and it's virtually impossible to build any sort of relationship against, again, a supplier that I know well in quarried products in the construction sector. They have very long-term relationships with their stone suppliers in India, where they've been working with them for 20 years, and they've helped to build schools for the kids, and they look at how people are employed and make sure that that the children actually go to school. They're not. If children are working, then they're getting an education as well, because in some parts of the world, the children are the only people in the family that are able to work. So there seems to be a big difference between establishing those very long-term relationships with the supply chain, where a relationship can be built up and there can be engagement in addition to auditing, as against some supply chain practices where it just appears to be impossible to achieve any sort of transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps just kind of building on our previous point as well, I think, assuring ESG characteristics must go hand in hand with the product provenance or the chain of custody of that product. So I don't agree that, you just have couple of organizations in your supply chain and those are meeting certain criteria, but you also need to think about the traceability and the chain of custody in parallel to that. I think that is such a good point in terms of I work a lot in these sectors that are spot buying the materials from the market, right? Like one day you have metals from certain countries, a couple of years a couple of days later those will come from totally different countries. And so I think what is really important here is to understand the role of traders as well, and understand how markets operate and what are the risks and the challenges that these operations will pose to the end clients and the end customers. So if I work a lot, first thing that cast houses tell me, so cast houses where you mix different parts of metals together to make a final product. And, first thing they tell me, well, I may know where one or two, primary metals are coming from, but, we are buying scrap from the market. We, that is really, really, there's a lower level of visibility available there. So, and that is something, for instance, the ASI recognized, early on, and the new iteration of their chain of custody standard, for instance, there are particular requirements for traders and how you can construct contracts with the traders so that you have an approved list of suppliers for primary metal. Those need to be all, for instance, ASI certified, and what is the documentation that needs to be provided by the trader. So it becomes the trader's responsibility in order to fulfill their contract to demonstrate these ESG characteristics, whether they source from Kazakhstan, South Africa, Brazil, wherever they source from. These customer expectations are communicated down the supply chain. And I think this is where what I see as the biggest bottleneck. And we are very much at the beginning of this journey. But I think the role of the brands is to ask, is to continue pushing, is to continue investing in due diligence and cascading these best practices and requirements. And at least we now have it in writing, right? It's in writing that this is an industry best practice, and the OECD due diligence guidance has been referenced a lot in the industry as well as another vehicle through which these common expectations will be pushed down the value chain. So slow progress, but a very challenging question, but there are solutions out there that companies can refer to.
You talked earlier about things like using satellite technology and that sort of thing in addition to personal visits. Where do you see the role of technology generally in supply chain transparency? I'm thinking technologies like blockchain, which I probably have an incomplete understanding of, but technology is moving on, and how are things changing in your world?
Another great question that we could spend the rest of the podcast on, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. So with digital technologies, as I mentioned, right, you're looking at kind of the side by side ESG characteristics. So this site is ESG, and then you are then reporting this maybe in your sustainability report that X% of my supply chain is meeting my supplier code of conduct or responsible sourcing policy. Now, with the digital product passport regulations coming in, companies will need to provide that provenance and that visibility at a product level. So that will be really quite a game changer in terms of understanding each batch, what are the particular characteristics of this product batch, where do they come from, who is the supplier, and what is the ESG performance of that supplier at that product level. So I think that's going to be quite game changing. And technologies such as blockchain is already being used. I feel that the key kind of blocking point is really understanding that value proposition. Why should brands do this, and are their customers interested? So I think if you think about EV vehicles and automotive, there's a much clearer, I would say, value proposition there, because consumers, we want to make sure that when we are buying an EV vehicle and the battery and the whole EV car is meeting these ESG expectations, and we want to see some more information about it. So I think in certain industries this will happen much quicker than in others. In terms of other digital enablers, I mentioned worker voice, or I could also mention supply chain data collection. So things like carbon emissions, or things like social and human rights impacts. Companies have two issues. They either have too much data, so big data that they can't make sense of, or they have too little data. And I think that is key paradox when it comes to supply chain sustainability, that either you have too much information or not enough information, or not enough information that you can trust, right? So I think increasingly what we see with our clients is implementing a digital system that is able to gather this information. So there are product hierarchies in there, so you understand what is tier 1, what is tier 2, what is tier 3. You're able to map these relationships in a digital tool, and then you can automate this engagement. So I mean, if you're engaging with 600-700 suppliers every year, this is a very costly thing to do. Like you will have a lot of interns just picking up the phone and phoning these suppliers to provide an ESG certificate. So I think automating this engagement and getting verifiable information out of the suppliers is really key. So integrating the supply chain data collection process with an assurance process behind it, so that there are periodic checks that exactly those carbon data or human rights data can be trusted is really important. And these are the key things that we're working on with our clients at the moment.
Again, interesting question about kind of data and reliable data. Again, what I'm starting to see is as demand builds rapidly for new stuff, then it's a bit like the Wild West out there, because the regulation doesn't catch up with the product. And pieces of work recently that I've been looking at, solar panels. Everybody wants solar panels. Most of them come from China. It's very, it's a very Chinese dominated market, and that market is not very transparent. Hydro-treated vegetable oil. Everybody wants a diesel substitute, and this is the magic bullet that's going to solve our problems, except once again, there are issues around the source. What's the primary feedstock for HVO? It can be palm oil, it can be waste cooking oil, it can be lots of different things. And hydrogen, of course, everybody wants hydrogen now, because hydrogen is the new thing. And there are various different colors of blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, purple spots hydrogen, whatever, depending on how the hydrogen is made. And there seems to be a perception at the top of the value chain that the chief executive says we need to decarbonise, so we're going to get some of this stuff. But actually, the value chains are more complex than that. And there isn't a nice certificate like FSC for my timber or whatever that tells me that's a reliable product. How are you seeing this sort of emerging market for new things against the potential lack of regulation or reliable certification for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, mentioned solar, for instance. I've been working in the solar industry for the past two to 3 years now. So when first reports came out of some polysilicon, which is a key component of the solar PV modules, being associated with forced labor risk in the Xinjiang region. And there were a number of NGO reports coming out and linking the solar industry, but also other industries like aluminium or cotton as well to these risks. And I think that's where since then the kind of forced labor ban in the US and in the EU now as well have really, I would say, sprung a whole myriad of initiatives that the industry has now kind of responded to. But I think at the start of the conversations, many investors or companies came to that, Laura, how can you assure that this product is not associated with human rights abuses, or it's not associated with forced labor? And this is the $1 million question, right, in terms of how you can assure this system. And I don't think we have a definite answer yet. These questions, mentioned FSC and timber and palm oil. So some, or cotton. So some industries have experienced these, responsible sourcing risks much earlier on. And they developed their own industry initiatives that responded. So with different levels of chain of custody, there came different levels of assurance. And I think that is what we see with for instance, solar as well now, that the industry again came together. They wanted to make sure that the whole system is built on a kind of as a credible approach. So bringing together NGOs, bringing together the EU Commission, for instance, and industry leaders to define these benchmarks. And I think what is happening is exactly kind of building that business case of why you should provide that supply chain visibility. Why is it important? And I think it's not just about the regulations coming in, but it's really around the longer term viability of the industry. So here solar products are so dependent on these rapidly developing supply chains, and solar has become the price of solar energy has really dropped and plummeted over the last few years. And the EU commissioner's kind of keynote speech really stuck with me at the beginning of December, who said, well, we want solar without regrets. So it's not enough that solar industry is seen as always part of the climate transition, as part of the good guys, but they have some skeletons in that in that cupboard. So they need to work very diligently with their partners. Again, disengagement is used as last resort, right? I think where we are at the moment is to build that business case, work with the module manufacturers to understand, where these, where the silicon sources are, where the silicon sources are, and map out this supply chain in the first instance. And I think that's where the industry is at the moment, to build that business case. It's not a quick win again. So, there needs to be some strategies in terms of diversification. And, there's more and more talk in the EU and the US to build kind of more capacities here or outside of China. But, there is no question about it that there will be a continuous relying on these resources. And so, again, I'm coming back to building supply chain capacity and engagement as key success factors. But that's not easy to do.
Yeah, thank you. I think, as you say, it's a continuous challenge, and there'll always be new stuff coming to market where the regulation and the certification follows on behind. Final question, if I can, because I could talk about this for the rest of the day. A lot of our audience, the people that listen to our podcast, are in some way involved in supply chains or involved in the procurement profession. What would be your advice to a procurement person going, oh, I'm hearing about all this ESG stuff. How do I tackle it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, starting with the policies and the strategy, right? Like, I think do an assessment of what has worked well in the past and where are the key gaps. I think one thing that is often missing for me is around checking and monitoring the effectiveness of these measures, right? Like, just really understanding, okay, I've done all these audits, I've done this, supply chain engagement survey, I've done these, questionnaires, and so, almost just like collecting this data is almost like a success in itself. And so companies just are like, okay, well, we take a break now, and we collected the data, so well done, and often kind of lack a really kind of systemic review of, well, based on this, how can I reassess my risk profile? Where are my opportunities? And what is the materiality of these impacts? Where are my material impacts? That's where I would start, is to really understand, at a high level, at a supply chain mapping, what are the different commodities that, or products that I'm procuring, and what is the kind of inherent, geographic or category risk? What is the existing information that I have, and what is it telling me about my risk profile? And so where should I invest? Where does it really count? Where there could be perhaps, I have low or medium risk suppliers, and there maybe I'm okay if I just collect some data from them through a digital tool once a year, but then I have my strategic suppliers, or I have my kind of high risk suppliers, and there I really want to make sure that they have a good grip on these ESG risks. So I'm going to spend more time, more money, more resource actually understanding that risk exposure.
Yes, it's all about priorities. Couldn't agree more. Laura, it's been fascinating getting an insight into the world of the auditor and some of the complexities that we see in these multi-tiered supply chains. So thank you very much. I'm sure our audience are going to love hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.